And welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Want to talk today a bit about charter, freedoms, and rights. Well, over the last few years, it kind of got overridden during that COVID pandemic for sure. It seemed that most of the judges ruling in the court cases were saying, hey, you know what? Okay, so your rights got trampled on somewhat, but that was in one sense wrong, but it was justified. Okay, there's some stipulations in the charter and so forth. So we're going to delve into this a bit deeper today with a lawyer who has fought very hard for your rights and freedoms and our charter rights. So John Carpay joins us from Calgary. He's the president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, their website jccf.ca. And he also has a new book out, and we want to focus on that today. It ties in with all of this. It's called Corrupted by Fear: How the Charter Was Betrayed and What Canadians Can Do About It. In fact, I went online and bought a copy yesterday. So good to have you with us, John.
Glad to be with you, Paul.
Yeah, and it looks like, from what I see on Amazon, you're off to a good start. Looks like it's a bestseller already within a day in several different categories. So congrats on that, and hopefully a whole bunch more being sold. Let me ask you, who is this book written for, and what do you hope that readers will take home?
It's written for Canadians, for the general public. I think it's a book that lawyers will enjoy reading and will get a lot out of, but it's not written for lawyers. It's written for the public. And I go through some history of what happened with rights and freedoms in Germany in the 1930s and how the legal profession did not defend rights and freedoms, but the judges and lawyers embraced ideology. And then the middle part of the book is all about recent Canadian court rulings, which are very disturbing because I provide examples of judges who wrote things into their judgment that were based on the 6 o'clock news and not based on evidence that was placed before the court. And then in the concluding section, I talk about what Canadians can do to defeat what I call modern fascism, which is superficially different from the fascism that we saw in Europe in the 20s and 30s, but scratched beneath the surface, and we're actually dealing with the same thing.
Yeah, I think you may be right, and I know you're going to get nailed with your conspiracy theorists and so forth. But man, look at the evidence and look at the similarities, the patterns there, and you have to kind of go, Now, maybe John has a point here. We should give this some consideration. And as you mentioned, you give your readers a bit of a history lesson. That's always good, because if you don't remember your history, it's bound to be repeated, right? As the saying goes there. I mean, you're talking about some eerie similarities with Nazi Germany. I mean, when you look at even the judges and law societies there, the media, the church, for that matter, okay, buying into the use of fear tactics, and parental rights were also tossed aside during that time. You know, it was like nobody dared to ask the tough questions. I mean, there were some, of course, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I just saw that movie recently, worth seeing for sure. And, the public decides, you're right. We need big government to take care of us from cradle to grave. You need to protect us at the expense of individual freedoms, by the way. We didn't mention that, right? Kind of forgot to mention that part. I mean, it sounds a little bit familiar to what we went through, 2019, 2020, et cetera.
Well, the National Socialists in Germany, they played upon the legitimate fear of communism that most Germans had. Most Germans were against the communists, but this was not some fringe movement. Like in Canada, you have elections and Marxist-Leninist gets, 1/10 of 1% of the vote. Mm-hmm. In Germany, the Communist Party at one point got 17% of the vote, which is nothing to sneeze at. And communists were in power in Russia, almost next door to Germany. And so the people were terrified that these godless communists were going to destroy religious freedom and burn down churches and execute, murder factory owners and landowners and clergymen and anybody who opposed the regime. And so they had what I would say it's a legitimate fear of communism. It was a ugly, tyrannical system that looked like it stood a real chance of taking power in Germany. And so Hitler played on that fear very, very successfully. And he sold himself to voters as the most aggressive, most ruthless, most effective anti-communist, and he was going to save Germany from the communist menace. He also talked about, saving Germany from the Jews, and that was also a menace. But he actually, before seizing power, he played on the fear of communism far more than anti-Semitism, although anti-Semitism was also there as well. And then he maintained that fear throughout the 12 years when the National Socialists ruled Germany. Anytime anybody stepped out of line, the police and the court system and the prosecutors would say, well, this is communist agitation. One of the cases I review in my book is where some church youth groups were playing soccer, and this was contrary to some regulation. And so they were charged and prosecuted. And the judge said, we can't have people disobeying these rules in the name of religious freedom. We've got to stop communism. So even kids playing sports together was deemed to be communist agitation and a threat to the regime.
Wow.
And the lawyers and the judges cooperated with the National Socialists. They did not defend rights and freedoms which had been in place before Hitler took power.
Yeah, you don't appreciate your freedom so much until you lose it, and then you go, man, I really missed that, right? So we want to make sure that doesn't happen again. Now, you write about the pattern we've seen here with judges ruling that, yes, on the one hand, citizens' rights and freedoms, charter rights were violated, but it was justified. Okay. Can you explain how this is supposed to work and how far too often the government really failed to provide the scientific hard evidence that they should have there, and why judges failed to hold governments accountable?
So the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in Section 2, we have the freedoms of conscience, religion, expression, association, peaceful assembly. In Section 7, we have the right to bodily autonomy, which includes choice of medical treatments, which translates into a right not to be pressured or coerced into getting injected with mRNA. And but Section 1 of the Charter says that governments can place reasonable limits on these charter rights and freedoms if they are demonstrably justified with persuasive evidence in a free and democratic society. And so the Justice Centre's lawyers launched, we had court actions all in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, all across Canada. We had these court actions to challenge lockdowns. And in court, typically, the government would admit quite readily, quite easily, that yes, lockdowns did violate the freedoms of association and peaceful assembly, expression, religion, conscience. Governments admitted that. It wasn't too much of an argument. But government said it's demonstrably justified. What we have, unfortunately, and this is the first, as far as I know, the first book in Canada that reviews and goes through examples and exposes that what judges did was that they repeated what they heard on the 6 o'clock news, wrote that into their court judgments, and did not take a hard look at the evidence that was placed before them. And my thesis is that let me back up a little bit. I travel all over Canada. I'm away from Calgary about once a month on average. And I kept on getting asked during lockdowns, what's going on with these judges? Are they getting thick wads of $100 bills, or are they getting a brown envelope stuffed full of cash, or are they getting a threatening phone call from the Prime Minister or from the Premier or from Klaus Schwab or World Economic Forum? What's up with these judges? And my answer is that no, I do not believe that judges were getting thick wads of $100 bills, nor do I think they were getting threatening phone calls from the Prime Minister or the Justice Minister, but they were as corrupted by fear as the rest of the population. Canadians were terrified of the daily fear-mongering, which is not grounded, not supported by evidence, but the way the human mind works is if we hear a message 100 times, we come to believe that it's true. And so the judges got caught up in the same fear that the rest of the public did. And so we have some really frightening outcomes. As just one example, in our court challenge in Manitoba to the lockdown restrictions there, the judge wrote in his ruling that COVID was unprecedented and that it was the worst global pandemic in over a century, both of which are false. COVID is not unprecedented. We had the Spanish flu of 1918, which was at least 100 times as bad as COVID. And we had the Asian flu of 1957 and the Hong Kong flu of 1968, both of which were more deadly than COVID. So there's zero evidence before the court to make these false claims that COVID was unprecedented and the worst global pandemic in a century. Both of those are false claims, yet they're written into the court judgment. Where does he get this from? I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind is that that's what he heard on the 6 o'clock news.
Yeah.
Or any other, we got 24 hours a day of news now, or it's something he read on the internet and it's something that he heard over and over again.
Well, it must be true then. John, if it was on the internet, it's got to be true, right? I mean, we got bombarded literally multiple times per day with new updates on how many people died horribly from COVID. And I don't want to, play down or downplay any of the, horrible deaths.
And some of those
deaths were bad. Absolutely.
Some of those deaths were real. In the same Manitoba case, the expert evidence that testified on behalf of the citizens, Dr. J. Bhattacharya, world renowned, world famous, universally highly regarded prior to lockdowns, and then of course suddenly he gets dismissed as being some sort of an anti-science kook. But Dr. J. Bhattacharya, along with the former chief medical officer of the province of Manitoba, Dr. Joel Kettner, between the two of them, they eviscerated the case for lockdowns. And what the judge does is very clever. He ignores Dr. Kettner's report entirely. Dr. J. Bhattacharya's report, he mentions parts of it and kind of lays it out. And then he rules in favor of the government. He does not explain in this lengthy court ruling, it's the size of a short book, 367 paragraphs. In this very lengthy court ruling, he does not explain why he preferred the evidence of the government of Manitoba over the evidence of Drs. J. Bhattacharya and Dr. Joel Kettner. And that's really frightening.
Shouldn't a judge, I'm not sure what the legal requirements are, but shouldn't a judge be required to, write out why he came to that conclusion? I mean, that's just logical.
Well, a ruling where, if the judge says, well, I've heard the evidence of the plaintiff and the defendant, and I think the plaintiff's evidence is better and stronger, so I rule in favor of the plaintiff. Well, that's not good enough. He has to explain why he accepted the plaintiff's evidence as being better and stronger and more persuasive. He has to debunk the defendant's evidence. So in order for this to be a court ruling that is actually worthy of respect, the judge should have debunked the expert reports of Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. Kettner. He does neither. Dr. Kettner's report, he ignores entirely. You'd never know the report existed if you read the judgment. And the report of Dr. J. Bhattacharya, the judge does not explain why he's rejecting that evidence, other than saying that the majority of doctors and the majority of scientists in the world at this time are in favor of lockdowns, and Dr. Bhattacharya represents a minority opinion. That's not how science works, We used to have 99% of doctors thought that it was not necessary for a doctor to wash his hands before delivering a baby. That was the consensus, and the guy that came out against it was mocked and ridiculed. So science doesn't work on the basis of majority vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And science is always evolving. It's getting better, et cetera. We learn from our mistakes and new discoveries are made and so forth. And we need to kind of roll with that, right? Take a good look. Ask lots of questions. What a concept, right? So can any of these judgments be challenged then because of that? There's a lack of, clear, clarity from the judge as to why he made the ruling. Can that be challenged, or are judges kind of basically above that at this point?
No, we've appealed most of those rulings, and I think that at the appellate level, the judges are also full of fear and not taking a hard look at the evidence. The other frightening thing about these court rulings is that the courts completely ignored all of the harms that lockdowns inflicted by way of damage to mental health, increases in drug overdose deaths, destroyed livelihoods, destroyed lives, destroyed businesses, canceled
Well,
surgeries.
people weren't going. Yeah, people weren't going for surgeries. They were avoiding the hospitals out of fear of catching COVID and dying. Right. So, do we have any? I mean, did the government, and they should if they haven't, have they done a thorough study of this, come up with some hard numbers, and figured out? Okay, let's look at all angles of this. Did the lockdowns produce more deaths and harm than the vaccine saved?
Well, this is what you've just articulated just now. That's what the Constitution of Canada requires. The Charter requires that if the government passes a law where any of our charter freedoms are violated, be it conscience, religion, expression, association, peaceful assembly, if any of these rights or freedoms is violated, one of the things the government has to prove in court with persuasive evidence is that the health order actually produced more good than harm. And we have none of that in any of these court rulings. In fact, in one of the cases, Randy Hillier versus Ontario, the judge in that case had before him the expert report of medical anthropologist Dr. Kevin Bardosh, who, with hundreds of citations, he reviewed all of the medical literature showing how much damage lockdowns had caused for Canadians. And he looked at all these different, mental health and anxiety, depression, suicide, isolation, financial damage. He looked at all of that and came out with this comprehensive expert report. And the judge proceeded to say he wasn't even going to look at the report because he decided, without an explanation, he decided that Dr. Kevin Bardosh is not qualified to comment on public health and on the lockdowns. And
wow,
without an explanation, it's just I'm not listening to what Kevin Bardosh has to say. So the judge completely ignores all of the compelling and abundant and persuasive evidence about all of the lockdown harms. The judge ignores it, and then goes on to say, well, lockdown saved a lot of lives, and it doesn't explain.
Doesn't provide evidence for that.
Doesn't provide evidence for that,
Okay.
and that there isn't any. But it's just one of these things people hear hundreds of times and they think that it's true. It's just that the lockdown saved a lot of lives, and they caused some inconvenience to some people. But stamp of approval, and I would be worried if I was pro-lockdown, pro-vaccine passport. I'd be worried about these court rulings because the judges have really lowered the bar for government and made it very easy for government to violate our rights and freedoms and have the judge say, well, I'm not qualified to comment on this, and so I'm just going to give it a pass, which is not why we have a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Wow. Well, if you're just tuning in here, the book is called Corrupted by Fear. You can get that at Amazon. It's off to a great start. Again, a lot of great information in this and a lot of real life cases that took place. And then we can see where freedoms were lost and where, again, I think judges, responding in a fear mindset. Very interesting that scripture apparently has 365 different mentions of do not fear. I think God knew what he was talking about. It's an issue for all of us as human beings. The fear of, COVID overtaking us. How bad was COVID, right? We need to ask that question. Your book deals with this. I mean, initially some experts were predicting, hundreds of millions of deaths worldwide. Of course, that did not happen. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians are going to die. Well, did that actually happen? Yes or no? It depends on how you count it, right? And as I recall, there were so many ways in which this was documented inaccurately. It was basically, if somebody died in the hospital and if they tested even, after death, they go, we should check to see if this person, let's do a nasal swab. And if they have COVID, well, then it's, a COVID death, even though the main cause of death was something completely different. I remember hearing about a case, I think it was actually in the UK, but where a guy fell off a ladder and died, and they, because he happened to have COVID at the time, it's now a COVID death. Will somebody stop, right? We had unreliable PCR COVID testing. We had, when you study the death rate, you pointed out in your book, the death rate, oddly enough, with this crazy pandemic, right, that we're all being scared of here, it didn't actually increase the rate of death, or if it did, it was very, very minimally.
Or it was in line with prior trends. So, for example,
Yeah.
in Italy and in Manitoba, to name two different jurisdictions,
Mm-hmm.
there's a very slow year after year increase in the death rate. It's going up very, very slowly. Why? Because we have an aging population, and most deaths statistically, most deaths occur amongst the elderly. I mean, of course, there are, babies
Mm-hmm.
that die and teenagers and people in their 20s. But if you look at the deaths, it's mostly people in their 70s and 80s disproportionately. So the death rates are going up slowly every year because you have an aging population
Right.
and not very many babies being born. And so, if it was true what the media and the politicians and the chief medical officers were telling us, that COVID is this unusually deadly killer, that everybody should be afraid, we should all live in fear, if that was true, you would have seen a significant jump in the death rates between 2019 and 2020. You'd see it jump up. What you get is you get this tiny little increase from 2019 to 2020 that's in line with all the other small increases in the years before and in the years afterwards. So there's just no evidence that COVID was. Well, the evidence is to the contrary. And don't take my word for it. Go
Mm-hmm.
online, pick
Yes.
your country, pick any country you want in the world: Peru, France, New Zealand. Pick any province, and you're going to see that all-cause mortality was not impacted by COVID, which means that the daily media fear-mongering was false. And it did follow people like Dr. Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London, who said that tens of
Yeah.
millions of people, tens of millions of people would die of COVID. That didn't happen. We had death rates lower than what we had experienced with the Asian flu of 1957 and the Hong Kong
Yeah.
flu of 1968, both of which were worldwide pandemics.
But we don't want to confuse anybody with facts, right? We'll just use fear instead. It works better. We were told to trust the science. And yet now, of course, truth comes out that, masking and social distancing measures weren't in fact based on science. How is it that entire nations came to the point where, we're going to trust the safety and efficacy research on experimental vaccines that was either conducted by the pharmaceutical companies themselves or by researchers who were paid by Big Pharma? I mean, how do we get to that point where we go, that's okay? I mean, it's like, again, a cigarette company saying, yes, we've just done the research and smoking is actually okay for you. You're going to be all right. Buy some more cigs, folks. And that's kind of what we did.
Well, you see this repeated in history. In Germany in the 1930s, the government said that its policies were scientific, and that because the science, or the settled science, was that handicapped people should be sterilized at least, or murdered. And so even before World War II began, the German government murdered tens of thousands of Germans, sterilized hundreds of thousands for things like schizophrenia, feeble-mindedness, hereditary deafness, hereditary blindness. The list goes on and on and on. It was a long list of different diseases. And so the government sterilized people and killed a lot of people. And this was done in the name of science because they said, this is the science. And they had experts, they had university profs who backed up the science. And unfortunately, when people believe that the science is on their side, they become entirely lacking in compassion, and they become quite fanatical and militant and aggressive towards anybody who's not following the science. And so we've seen this, and the history lesson is there for us to learn. Obviously, we'd not learned it when so many people embraced lockdowns in 2020.
Yeah, we need to be brave enough to ask the questions, even if people are making fun of you and saying you're a conspiracy theorist, nah. Well, in your book, you bring to light that during COVID, government politicians actually held secret committee meetings with judges as to how to handle court cases with the best available public health information. And I'm thinking maybe they meant well, but, the government is often, of course, a litigant in these court cases. So doesn't that kind of violate the impartiality that's supposed to be there? Yeah. Now again, somebody's going to say, oh, that's a conspiracy thing, but you're saying, no, you've got the evidence here. This actually did take place, right?
Well, the government itself announced that judges and politicians would be meeting together. They did not meet necessarily in regard to specific court cases.
Right.
And perhaps it's all benign and there's nothing to worry about. The problem that I stress in my book is the lack of transparency.
Mm-hmm.
So if a plaintiff and a defendant are suing each other over, say, breach of contract, and if the plaintiff or the plaintiff's lawyer has any kind of communication with the judge, no matter how minimal, the defendant, the other side, has the right to know about it and to know what was said. Even if it's something benign like, hey, I'm taking a family holiday next month. Can we, possibly move the next court hearing date to a different date? Any communication. And so we are going to dig down deeper. The book alerts the public to the problem, but we're going to be digging deeper and seeing.
Well, I'd love to hear what you uncover there. Okay, running out of time, but I'd love to hear from you. What can we do to counter, to stand up for our freedom here? What can the general public do right now?
First thing is to be informed yourself, and that's by looking at alternative or independent media like WizeUp.
Yeah.
You've got outlets, the Bridge City News and the Rebel, True North, Western Standard, Epoch Times.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to keep on listening to the CBC and other government-funded media as well, just to get their viewpoint. But do not limit yourself to government-funded media or the so-called mainstream media. Get yourself informed. Get active in the democratic process if you aren't already at the federal, provincial, municipal, and school board
I'll
levels.
have to jump in there because of time, but yeah, you talk about joining political parties, attending rallies, these kinds of things, donating even to your group here as well. Why not, right? This makes a difference, all right? So jccf.ca, the book is called Corrupted by Fear by John Carpay. I encourage you to put it into your library. This is important stuff, all right? It'll be very helpful for you. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Appreciate it. God bless.